afternoon, folks. Old Buster coming to you again. Got a good story. It's the longest one I've had for y'all ever since I started reading these stories. The name of this is Memphis. Before I get started, I want to give a little shout out, a howdy, to some folks. I said I'd say hello to them. One of them's old Hank and Hannah. We met them at the fair up here, you know. And they're going to get married up pretty soon. Just want to say hello to them. And then we got old Dave Singh. He's got India Palace over here, and he's always so sweet to me and Lulu. He always gives us some of that eggplant charcoal stuff. It's really good. Larpin' good, too, I'm here to tell you. Well, this old story, Memphis, has got 5 chapters and an epilogue. So we're going to stop in between each chapter. And y'all can take a little break. Need to take care of some business or whatever you need to do, eat, drink, whatever. Then y'all can come back to it so you'll know that you hadn't missed anything. Because it's going to take a while to read this thing. Now, I want you to know this is a little bit out of my order of what I normally do. So, I want to tell you why. This story's got old boy Billy Kane Bailey in it, you know. And he just dying to hear what we're saying about him. So we done took care of Walter last week, you know, the trickster and his brothers and whatnot. And I guess they all liked it, the girls and all, except maybe the oldest brother, old Melvin. He just never said a word. But hopefully he didn't get all ditherated over nothing. Of course, most of it's true, you know. According to Walter, that is. Anyway, the name of this is Memphis, Chapter 1. Jesse Darrell, don't you reckon you ought to slow down this old bucket of boats? It ain't going to take much more of a beating in these here gumbo wallers and buckshot washboards now. My hate has got some goose eggs that's real humdingers a cracking my noggin again atop of this here cat. We gonna lose life or limb if you don't slow down this old bob truck. Well, what you in such an all-fired hurry for anyhow? Well, I ain't going to tell you, 'cause you wouldn't have quit funning me, says Jesse. Oh, Jesse, I wouldn't do no such a cantankerous thing to you, don't you know? Well, it's a secret, but I'll sure enough give you a bit of a hint. Don't tell me, says Buster. I bet you I can guess what it is. What's you thinking then, said Jesse. Well, sir, seeing how you're in such a heck of a hurry, it has to be one of 3 things. Money, adventure, or a woman. But in this case, I'd say it was all 3. Am I right? Well, Jesse was a grinning like a Cheshire cat and said, "You know me too well, cousin." "I figure on us going on a trip," said Jesse, "but we got to get us some guineas first off." That's money, you know, that green. "I got a plan for sure," exclaimed Jesse. "You know that little red-headed gal out there from Sea Dump that you took a shine to?" "Reckon I do," says Buster. "She even went to sparking me a bit at the barn dance last Saturday night. Said she wanted to see my muscles and such, and was just running her fingers all up in my hair whilst we was a-dancing. Them pheromones of yourn sure do the trick, that's for sure. Well, her ma and pa want to give her a pony for her birthday." "We ain't got no pony," says Buster. "Well, big boy Billy Kane Bailey does. He traded for it about a month ago and hates that darn thing with a passion. It done throwed him a bit, and to boot, he wants rid of it." That means he bit him once, you know, and then throwed him too, if I didn't get that clear to you. "We ain't got no money, Jesse, so how are we going to pay for it?" "Well, old man Collins has a barn to clean and a load of firewood to deliver. Said he would give us whatever was left from his sawing, plus an old boar he wants to get rid of." "Well, that ain't no greenbacks neither," said Buster. "What we going to do with all this there stuff?" "Well, Pinky wants the wood for his hands for the winter and to cook with, and they will pitch in and with the loading and the stacking. Well, Mr. Chicken James wants a new boar for his and Sal so we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. All this here horse trading and a swapping can all be done today, but we gotta hurry. Well, all the fellers live right close by, so we can move pretty quick with you of using them muscles of yourn," said Jesse. Well, Mr. Chicken and Mr. Collins have an old Model A truck that needs some work and tires, and Hiram Nix over to Keogh will take that there Model A for an even swap for a Ford in. Well, Mr. Hiram used to sell all them old Model T and Model A parts and can fix that old truck up lickety-split. Knowing him, he got himself a buyer in from Little Rock. That still don't leave us with nothing, moaned Buster. Well, now, I happen to know that big boy Billy Kane wants a Ford tractor and will swap the pony for it. Well, little right-headed Emily Ann will get her pony, and her pa will give us a trip to Memphis and $10 each, hard cash, with Emily Ann and her cousin Rachel Elizabeth and the rest of the family. Well, that's her mom. Plus, he's going to let us use his and packaging machine for one evening for your stuffed strawberries you done come up with. We're going to sell them at the county fair and make a killing. I tell you that for sure now. Them things gooder than snuff. If it all goes well and we do good, Mr. Stevens said he would see about going into business with us and selling them to major stores and whatnot. Now you know why I'm in a hurry. Now, hold on a minute, Jesse. Ain't you forgetting something? What's that, says Jesse. That little chestnut-haired Rachel gal, now ain't she the one you been a-sneaking round back of the picture show after I take up the tickets on Saturdays? You been a-spying on me now, ain't you, says Jesse. Well, I got eyes, ain't I? And grinned like a old dadgum possum-eating Simmons, said Buster. Your hankering to sport that little gal put you to thinking, I'll bet. I just know there had to be all three for you to go off in a tizzy this early in the morning. Well, let's get to it. Memphis is a-waiting. Chapter 2. The boys pulled into Mr. Collins' place near about daylight and took to cleaning his barn. 'Tweren't but 4 stalls and some rabbit cages and a chicken coop to muck, so Buster took the manure and the spreader and put it on Miss Collins' garden spot to be plowed later on. Now that old boar hog was another story. He didn't rightly cotton to Jesse, and Jesse was a-hollering to Buster to get on over there and put his and muscles to good use for corralling that there hog. Another thing, Buster knew Miss Collins would be right happy that he spread that manure on her garden. Wasn't in their deal, but he always trying to do something that's good for some folks. Well, Buster said you are going about it all wrong, harassing that old boy. Get on the loose and let me do it now. Well, Buster said to go get the slop bucket and some hog feed, and I'll make him trail up into the loading chute, but that old boar hog will follow him a-grunting and a-eating all the way. Well, Jesse closed the gate whilst Buster scratched that old boar behind the ears. Before Buster could get on out of the loading chute, that old boar had done laid on down and went right off to sleep. I reckon it was nigh on to 10 o'clock a.m., that is, that's morning time, when Pinky and his hands showed up to load the firewood. Well, Pinky told the boys he needed 2 cords of wood, and the boys and his hands went to loading it into the bob truck. Well, Buster had Jesse back up to the wood pile, and they got to chunking wood so fast it'd make a feller's head swim. A regular assembly line it was. The boys in Pinky's hands was working up a sweat for sure when it come on to dinner time. Well, Buster was some peckish, and they had forgot their dinner buckets and being such a hurry as it was. Well, Miss Collins come by and told them all to meet her up on the porch at the house. She set a spread of biscuits and gravy and pan-fried taters, which you know was Buster's favorite. Some maters and corn on the cob and fried okra and sugar-cured hickory smoked ham, and that was done in their own smokehouse. They had sweet iced tea and apple pie topped it all off. Well, Buster was the first to dig in and the last to leave the table. The boy does like to eat. Well, Miss Collins was just a-smiling at Buster. She told Jesse that Buster's grandma had called her and told her the boys went off without something to eat, and would she kindly feed them dinner. Well, Miss Collins told Buster's grandma Claire to think nothing of it. She would be glad to do so for her. Said she planned on feeding them when Mr. Collins told her all of them was a-coming this morning anyhow. Well, everybody thanked Miss Collins for dinner, and after another hour or so, all the wood was loaded. Well, Buster drove the bob truck with the wood over the county road, across the bridge, in Bio, and the back way to Keogh. The wood was unloaded with some more Pinky's hands at the houses where the hands had stayed. Well, one of the women folk there had fetched some sweet iced tea for the boys along with some fried chicken for a snack. Well, Buster took to sucking on a chicken neck, so Jesse had to drive. Jesse took off hightailing it back to the Collins place for the old boar, kicking up dust all the way. Well, Jesse backed up to the loading chute and opened the gate. The old boar just stood there and wasn't going to load. Well, Buster jumped up and took out an apple that was given to him by one of the hands and coaxed that old boar into the truck. Well, off they went a-waving at Miss Collins on the way to Chicken Jane's place, and they pulled in there around about 3 o'clock that afternoon with Chicken out at the barn a-doing chores. Well, Jesse said hello to Mr. Chicken, told him they was delivering his boar hog. He said to back on up to the hog pen and turn him loose. Well, it didn't take no coaxing for that old boar, I'm a-telling you. He seed them sows and they took off a-running. Well, Mr. Chicken seed the pile of wood in the back of the bob truck and asked what the boys was a-doing with all that there firewood. Well, Jesse said they had it left over from delivering some over to Pinky's place. Well, how much you reckon you got left there? Queried Mr. Chicken. Well, Buster said he figured upward to 2 quart. Well, Chicken said he'd give $25 for 'em. Well, Jesse said, make it $30 and we'll unload it for you. Chicken said to back up to the house and stack it up under the porch. Well, Buster and Jesse got right to it, and some hands of Mr. Chicken showed up and began to help them. Well, all the wood was unloaded in less than an hour, and then Mr. Chicken had the hands load the Model A truck in the back of the bob truck and chocked her up real good, them tires, so they wouldn't move, and they had all that done to boot. The boys was on their way with 30 Morgan silver dollars in their pockets after thanking Mr. Chicken for everything. Next stop, Mr. Hiram Nix's store. Tire store, you know. It didn't take long to swap out that there Model A truck for the Ford-N tractor. Well, Mr. Hiram had his men to unload and load and then give the boys an RC and a moon pie to boot before they headed on out to Big Boy Billy Kane's place for the pony. It was getting on towards evening when the boys pulled up to Billy Kane's barn. He seed 'em a-coming and met 'em at the barn. They loaded the Shetland pony after Billy got his and Ford-N out the back of the bob truck. He was a-grinning from ear to ear, declaring he was sure glad to be rid of that there pony. Mainer'n a snake, he says he was. He said, boys, I just got to hear that old Ford run. Well, sir, he cranked it up and went to driving around the field next to his barn just a-laughing, just a-caterwauling, I'm telling you. He pulled back up to where the boys was and said he was proud as punch with that there tractor. He was going to give her a new paint job and a good once-over and put her to work. Well, the boys started to leave with the pony, and Billy Kane hollered after him to wait up a minute there. You forgot something, he says. Get the saddle and tack from the tack room over there before you leave. Well, Jesse wasn't a-figuring on that for sure, and that was sure no bonus. Well, Buster and Jesse gathered up all the tack and even some feed Billy Kane wanted them to take with them and get rid of it and headed on over to the Stevens place. Now, about 5:45, the boys pulled up to the yard. Of course, it's still daylight now. All the family come out to meet the boys and waved them and said hello. Well, Mr. Stevens told Emily Ann to come to the back of the truck. He lifted her up where she could see over the side, and she lit up like a Christmas tree when she seen that beautiful pink Shetland pony. Happy birthday, darling, he said. She was just a-beaming from ear to ear, I tell you, and when she seen Buster, she run up to him and hugged his neck something fierce like. Well, Mr. Stevens said, let's get him unloaded. The pony, that is. When Buster began to unload the feed and all the tack, Mr. Stevens told him he didn't figure on all of that would come with the horse. He said they would stay for supper, and he wanted to see him, Jesse, before they left on out to home. Well, Rachel Elizabeth was staying with the Stevens family for a spell whilst her folks was out back east tending to her ailing aunt and would be back in a month if it all went well. The girls and the boys sit in the parlor a-talking about their upcoming trip whilst Miss Stevens made them some hot chocolate along with some peanut butter cookies. Well, Mr. Stevens come in and went to discussing all they was going to do in Memphis. The zoo and Graceland, the home of Elvis Presley, the Pink Palace, and some eating places he knowed of for barbecue and catfish, along with a surprise for 'em all, was on his agenda. Well, after them a visit for a spell, the boys said their goodbyes and headed for the bob truck. Now, Mr. Stevens followed them on out and thanked the boys for the pony and everything else they done. He said he would tell them what day they would leave and talk to their folks, too, about his plans for them. He pulled out his billfold and give each of them a $10 gold piece as per their agreement, and then said he wanted to show his appreciation and then give them each a $20 U.S. savings bond. Well, both the boys was plumb tongue-tied, I tell you. Mr. Stevens, would you mind going with me over to the barn before we leave on out, said Buster. To tell the truth, Billy Kane Bailey didn't cotton to the pony, and I've been a-studying on why. The three of them soft-fodled on over to where the pony was in his stall. Well, Buster began to looking at the pony's mane and see the cockleburr underneath it. He then looked at the saddle blanket and seed some there too. Well, Buster pulled them all out and declared that was the reason the pony was such a fit when he was saddled and mounted. I'd buck too if them birds was a-sticking me, said Buster. Buster also checked each hoof too, and they was all right. Well, there you go. I think he'll be all right now. He'll be safe to ride for Miss Emily Ann. Well, Mr. Stevens was plumb stupefied, as they say. Said he wouldn't have never thought of a bird being the problem. I can see you would sure take care of my little Emily Ann. She is our onlyest child, you know. Miss Stevens almost died giving birth to her and can't have another baby, so you can see Emily Ann is real special to us. Yes, sir, says Buster. She is a fine young lady and will always be respected. Well, I know your people, and y'all come from fine stock, and you boys are well thought of, said Mr. Stevens. That is why we don't mind y'all sparking our gals. Well, thank you, sir, exclaimed both Buster and Jesse. We was both raised right. Well, it's more than that. Enough said. Well, have a safe trip home. When y'all are ready to use the packaging machine, just let me know, and I'll set it up for you one evening after my employees are finished for the day. Well, let's hit the road, Jesse, said Buster, and the boys waved goodbye as they drove on off. Not a bad day at all, said Jesse. Not bad at all. Chapter 3. Well, Big Jim Hired's pa hollered for the boys to hurry on up and fetch his and tools so they could get on the road. Well, Hired done called up Buster and Jesse and asked them if they wanted to go to Little Rock with his and Paul on the job he had over there for the government. They'd be overnight, and if they'd help him out, they could have some ice cream and go to the picture show at the Center Theater on Main Street. Heck yeah, said the boys. It was surely a treat to get to go to the big city, I tell you. Well, Big Jim's one-ton pulling his and backhoe would take most of the morning, but they would begin work as soon as they got there and work late. Well, Big Jim Holmes had a reputation of first-class work and took pride in his skill in the trade. He got the job from a feller that his foreman had used in the past that knowed Big Jim. Well, Big Jim didn't rightly go that far out the county to do work, but the pay was double and it needed to be done before Monday morning. The road work out over the cliff on Cantrell Road was a mite dangerous, but Big Jim knowed he could do it with the boys' help. Well, after getting to the job site and setting up, it didn't take long to make hay till dark come on. It was late, and Big Jim and the boys tucked in at a motel after feeding them at Sandy's home place. It was a place where a body could eat all the home-cooking food they wanted till they was fuller than a tick. Well, Buster was in hog heaven. You could only have one chicken fried steak, but everything else was up for grabs, all you could eat. Chicken and dumplings and boiled cabbage and black-eyed peas, sauerkraut and weenies, homemade rolls, gravy, corn, and pecan pie was on the steam table. Well, Big Jim figured on using the lights and working till midnight, so he could have more time with the boys after finishing up early on Saturday. He figured they would stay on to Sunday before going on back home. All the boys was early risers, seeing how they lived and worked in the country, so daylight brought them the notion of quitting before the Saturday matinee. Big Jim told the boys to get cleaned on up and that they done a heck of a job helping him get the job done before the deadline. He said he'd finish up and load and the boys could take the trolley uptown and go to the picture show and have a good time but be back before dark. Well, the boys spruced up a mite and caught the trolley to the center theater, and each of them had $2 apiece, and Big Jim give that to them to spend. The price of admission at the center was 25 cents. That's a 2-bit piece, where it was only a dime at the new theater in England. You know, it went up a nickel. It used to be a nickel, now it's a dime. That's why Buster takes up the tickets there. Miss Inez let him do that, you know. Well, popcorn was a dime with real butter, and soda water was a nickel. The double feature picture show was the Cisco Kid and Sky King, along with a Rocket Man Searle and a Roadrunner cartoon. It was getting late when the boys got out the picture show, and seeing how it was coming on to supper time, they decided to go to the job site and get Big Jim and go eat. Well, the trolley took them to the bottom of Cantrell Hill, and the boys walked on top looking for Big Jim where he was last seen digging. Well, Jesse and Hired was a bit of hay to Buster, 'cause he was a-snacking on a Baby Ruth candy bar when he heard them both a-holler. They done both fell in a hole, and Jesse was nowhere to be seed, but Hired was a-hanging on for dear life onto some roots there was hanging out. Well, Buster run up and grabbed a hold to Hired's hand, but it was slippery from the mud. Buster wouldn't turn her loose, and Hired drug them both into the hole. Well, Buster just couldn't get a toehold to hold them both, but wasn't going to let him go without him a-going too. They both tumbled to the floor of the hole, which turned out to be a tunnel of some sort. Well, it was about an 8-foot drop or so, and Jesse was at the bottom, kind of splayed out like. Well, Hired was none the worse for wear, but Buster turned on and Hired and fell on top of him, cushioning his fall. Well, Jesse was a-groaning a mite, but answered Buster when he called to him. "I'm okay," Jesse said, "just the wind knocked out of me." They all huddled up and began to call out for help, since there weren't no ladder around or a way to climb out. Well, after a spell, the boys give up a-calling and knowed it'd be daylight before anybody come along, and Big Jim would surely be worried sick about 'em, you know. "Well, we can't just sit around here," said Jesse. He took out his little pen light he always brung with him and told them that they had a light for a spell, and he was hoping it lasted long enough to get 'em out of this here tunnel. They all chewed the rag on which way to go and decided to head on south. Well, the boys lit out, and after a bit, and turned a corner, and lo and behold, there was a skeleton a-laying on the ground. That was enough to make 'em skedaddle, I tell you. Well, the boys regrouped and said they got to go back, seeing how that was the way they had to go to get out. When they returned and stepped over the skeleton, they seed at least a half a dozen more of 'em laid out on the ground. "What you reckon killed those folks?" said Buster. "Well, don't rightly know," said Jesse, "but they have sure enough been laid out proper like. It ain't like somebody just killed them and left them lay," said Hired. "Something fishy going on here, I'd say." Well, after passing by the bodies, the boys run up on a steel door at the end of the tunnel. It was locked and mostly bricked over, and by no means could the boys get it open. "Well," said Buster, "that leaves us going back north, don't it, boys? Let's get a move on. Time's a-wasting." Well, the boys walked back about an hour, picking their way through the tunnel and over and around about the skeletons. Well, Jesse piped up and said, "Boys, the light is a-flickering, and I don't reckon she's going to last long. We got to get." The boys picked up the pace and could see a mite of light at the end of the tunnel when they come up on a sack. Well, Buster picked up the sack, and 4 leather pouches fell out along with some gold eagles. "Now, what we got here," says Hart, "looks like a jackpot for sure. It sure seems old, don't you think?" Well, all the boys looked over to find with a fine-tooth comb. Quite a find at that. There was diamonds in the 4 pouches. Jesse seed it was some Murfreesboro diamond mine that he knowed had been closed and out of business for better than 30 years. Well, Buster grabbed up the sack and the boys took on out, but come to a hole full of water where Jesse liked to have stepped off into it. Well, Hired tackled Jesse, knocking him away from the water. What the devil was that for? Said Jesse. Well, Hired told Jesse to shine the light on the water. Well, Jesse did, and they all see the swirling mass in the water. Cottonmouth snakes a-mating, hundreds of them. Well, Hired said, you know, boys, I'm kind of good with critters, and rattlers ain't nothing to me, but these here cottonmouths will chase you and bite the fool out of you and kill you later than a doornail. Well, how you reckon we gonna get around them? Said Buster. Well, let me cipher on this a minute, said Hired. Knowing these snakes like I do, and especially them a-mating, if and we make a racket, the whole bunch is coming for us. There's a mite of a stepping stone on the right side, but the left one that is just under the water about 1 inch is another nowhere. See there where I'm a-pointing? I think that is the way to go. But we'll be in the water with the snake, said Jesse. True enough, said Hired, but this is how I figure it. This snake pit is a trap. Somebody set this up to keep folks out of here. I just don't know all about it yet, but I figure they must be crooks or better yet smugglers. I sure enough feel that the stepping stone on the right would pitch a feller right smack dab in the middle of them snakes, but the one on the left is solid, but you can't dilly-dally. The light about gone, said Jesse. If we're going to go, let's get at it and get her done. Well, Jesse, you go first and keep the light down on the stepping stone in the water for us to see where we're going. Buster, I want you to hightail it as fast as you can when I say go. I'm going to throw this here rock on the stepping stone on the right, and all hell's going to break loose with them snakes. When you get to the other side, keep a running. Well, Jesse, keep the light on us till we're across, then shine it towards the entrance. Y'all ready? When you hear the splash, run. Well, Jesse didn't let no grass grow under his feet, and Buster liked to run old Jesse. Hired come across to holler and run, and Jesse shined the light back towards Hired and seed snakes galore a-follering them. The snakes a-chasing them was gaining on them, spied Hired. Well, once the boys got to about the front of the entrance, they had to jump a ditch about 2 foot wide with all manner of green stuff in the bottom. The snakes fell into the ditch and began sizzling. Killed them dead as a mackerel. Jesse said he thought it was some kind of acid since it smelled like rotten eggs, sulfur acid he thought. Once out in the open, the boys found themselves on the banks of the Arkansas River. There wasn't no way up the bank there, but there was a skiff tied to a tree. It was coming on daylight, so the boys was a-hurrying, 'cause they knowed Big Jim would be in a tizzy. As they started to get in the skiff, Big Jim hollered down to them. He was overlooking the side of the cliff, but couldn't see the boys but heard them. Y'all boys down there, he hollered. Well, Hired hollered back, Pa, we's right here, but there ain't no way up. Should we take the skiff tied up to the tree? No, yelled Big Jim. I'm going to move the hole close to the edge and put the bucket over to the side with a rope to climb in it. Reckon you boys can do that? Well, sure enough, they hollered back. Well, Big Jim got all the boys back up on solid ground and went to quizzing them about what all happened. Hired told his and Pa about looking for them for supper and falling in the hole and about what all they seed and what all happened to them. Big Jim said there was a story about an old hospital and the medical school that used cadavers for teaching doctors and such. They used to keep them in a tunnel where it was cool since there weren't no other way to keep them from rotting. The tunnel was sealed up in the late 1800s or early 1900s. He didn't exactly know when. That thing about the snakes and ditches and stepping stones was sure enough a mystery, though. Back in the old days, smugglers was all along this here river and must have found the old tunnel some time or another. Seems like some recent folks have been here, though. Reckon we better call the police and fill them in on all this. I ain't called your folks yet, Buster and Jesse, said Big Jim. I was just about to when I heard y'all down below. Well, Buster Loudday was about tuckered out and wanted to know if Mr. Holmes would take him to get something to eat. You know he was all caved in. Well, all of them busted out a laughing at that. How about breakfast at the Capitol Hotel? It's all you can eat. Well, Buster did like to eat now. Y'all know that. Well, Big Jim let the boys get some sleep after they had their fill at the Capitol Hotel and went to visit the police chief about what all happened. He took the sack with the 4 pouches of diamonds and the gold eagles with him to give back if and that was the case. The chief see Big Jim right off, and they talked about what all happened for over 2 hours. The chief had his and people check out everything about the coins and the diamonds and found out that it was unclaimed and the boys rightfully owned them. The thing about all this is that the treasure is all well and good and explained for her, but the people that done all the setting the traps and leaving the skiff is the problem. I done sent my men over there and cordoned off the site, and the state is sending a team to permanently seal the tunnel since Cantrell is part of a state highway through town. There is no way to determine who the skeletons was, so they will remain buried in the tunnel. The chief said his concern was the folks that knowed about the treasure probably wanted it back. How they got it is a mystery, but they just might come a-looking for it. Big Jim said he'd speak with the boys' folks and put the coins and diamonds in the vault at the Bank of England. The chief said he would inform the England police chief and county sheriff as well as the state police about all this for them to be on the lookout for anything unusual down their way. Well, Big Jim thanked him and told him they had a ways to go, so he had to get the boys and head on back to the house. Well, good luck, said the chief, and old Jim, do you have a gun? Well, Big Jim turned around and grinned and said, reckon I do. Several, and went on out the door. Chapter 4. Well, Big Jim, Buster's grandpa Gus, and Jesse's grandpa Esther all went to the Bank of England and met up with the president, Mr. Seth Lewis. They all knowed each other quite well and confabbed on them diamonds and gold eagles. Well, after counting, the 4 pouches of diamonds had a gob of little medium-sized ones and one great big one that come to about 37 carats. It was a humdinger for sure. The gold eagles was 1907 St. Gaudens double eagles, and there was 100 of them. Well, Mr. Lewis told them that the boys had them a fortune here and to count theirselves lucky for sure. They all agreed to put the diamonds and coins in the bank and set up an account for each boy equal like. Well, Mr. Lewis said he would get the diamonds appraised and sold along with the coins and divvy up the cash betwixt the 3 boys. Big Jim told Mr. Lewis what all the police had to say and not to take any chances because there was always a chance of getting robbed. They was going to be on lookout for nefarious strangers as well. They thanked Mr. Lewis and said their goodbyes after having some coffee and jawing for a spell on what all this meant to the boys and their families. Well, Saturday come along and all the boys went to town over to Keogh, the Leaks drugstore, for some cherry phosphate and grilled cheese sandwiches and fries. There was a barn dance out there at the Henderson place that night, and they all allowed they'd gonna go. Talk was that everybody betwixt Allport and Tall-Tech knowed about what all happened to the boys. Looked to be quite an interesting evening with everybody asking questions of the boys and whatnot. Well, Alma Mae Snow was Hire's gal, and she was right friendly with both Emily Ann Stevens and Rachel Elizabeth Stevens, which was their first cousins, you know. The boys were having a high old time of dancing and sparking with the gals when Mr. Stevens come up to the boys and asked them if they was about ready for their trip and the use of his packaging machine. Well, since the spring soiree was a-coming up out at the fairground, he thought it'd be a good idea to try out selling them stuffed strawberries at Buster's out there before the county fair. Well, all right then, says Buster. We'll fix up a batch next Friday evening and bring 'em over to the package early Saturday morning to get 'em all ready to sell. Now, Mr. Stevens had done tried one of them, in fact, several of them, stuffed strawberries, and dearly loved 'em. He done come up with a way to put 'em in a little box with 4 to the box. Been looking farmers till y'all getting there about 8 o'clock, and I'll have the gals there to help box 'em up. The boy just couldn't wait to get to the Stevens place and box up the strawberries, but more so seeing the gals. Even though the strawberries would sell theirself, a pretty gal always helped, and the gals said they'd do the selling. Well, they rolled up to the fairground about 10 o'clock Saturday morning and set up shop at their booth. Right off, the gals went to selling lickety-split. They was a-going like hotcakes, and round about noon they was about to run out. That's when a couple of strangers come up and wanted to buy the rest of what they had on hand, plus six dozen more. Well, Mr. Stevens said he would run back over to the plant and get some more of the strawberries and to wait for 'em to get back with them. Wouldn't take long, he said. The strangers said that they would come back later and left the money for the strawberries on the counter. The boys were getting 50 cents a box, so it totaled to be right smart a sale for 'em. 6 dozen was 18 boxes for $9. Biggest sale of the day. Well, Mr. Stevens had been gone about 10 minutes when one of the strangers come up and pulled a gun on the gals. Well, Emily Ann hollered for Buster, and he come a-running out from behind the booth. The biggin' stranger that was bald-headed and broad as an ox and looked sunburnt told Buster to call up the other young'uns, but be quiet or he'd shoot Emily Ann. Buster gathered up Jesse and hired Alma Mae and Rachel Elizabeth, whilst the other stranger come in from behind them with his and pistol pull. That feller had real long black hair almost down to his waist, with tattoos all over his arms and neck. The strangers told them all to be real quiet-like and start walking towards the back of the service entrance of the fairground. The gals began to cry, but the strangers told them to shut up or they'd kill them. The one stranger with the tattoos was called Rocco and the other Jake. There was a panel truck waiting, and the strangers told them all to get on in. Well, Buster wasn't going to have none of it and grabbed a hold of Jake as he was pushing Emily Ann in the truck. Now, Jake didn't figure on Buster being as stout as he was and was a-hollering for help. Well, Rocco come up and whacked Buster alongside his and Hade and laid open his and scalp. Well, Buster was a-bleeding like a stuck hog, you know, but 'tweren't addled as much as they thought he was. Well, Rocco said another stunt like that and he was going to kill 'em one by one, and the gals first. The driver was some skinny kid named Irvin, and Rocco told him to get to driving to the hideout. They got to the old river to an old shotgun house where Gene Henderson had poker games and told them all to get on to the house. Well, after all the young'uns was gathered up and tied up, Rocco told the boys he wanted some answers. And every time they lied, he was going to cut off one of the gals' fingers. Jesse spoke up and asked him just what he wanted to know. Well, Rocco wanted to know where the treasure was. Buster said we ain't got it. Where is it? Asked Jake. Our paws took it to the bank for safekeeping, said Jesse. Now ain't that just convenient, said Rocco. Get me them pruning shears over there, Irvin. Now wait just a minute there, said Buster. We done told you the truth. Ain't no reason to hurt nobody. What bank you talking about? Said Jake. The Bank of England, said Buster. That's all we know. Well, Rocco called Jake and Irvin together and had a confab in the next room. Well, Irvin, get me a pen and paper. I gotta write a letter. You seem to be a bright little red-headed gal, but your name, what's your name? Said Roscoe. Emily Ann Stevens, she answered defiantly. That your pa that went after the strawberries? Yes, it is, she answered. Well, this is what you gonna do. Then Rocco dictated the letter to Mr. Stevens. After Emily Ann wrote the letter, he told Irvin to deliver it pronto. By the time Mr. Stevens got back to the fairgrounds, everything was in an uproar. Some folks up on the Ferris wheel seed what all happened and was a-hollering up a storm. Deputies was patrolling the grounds and come a-running. Mr. Stevens come up on the melee and got told his and young'un and the others got kidnapped. He immediately called all the other parents and they all met up at the police station. The deputies got a description of the panel truck and the 3 strangers and put out an APB on all of them in the truck. That's all points bulletins. That's so all them police can get after them. Whilst all this was a-going on, Irvin tied the letter round the rock and throwed it through the window at the Stevens house. Now, Miss Stevens was just on her way to the police station when the rock come flying through the window, and she about had a heart attack over it. She called the police, and they come picked her up along with the rock and the letter. When she got to the police station, she give the letter to the chief, and he read it to everybody. The letter said they wanted the money or the diamonds and gold coins. If they didn't get them in 4 hours, they was going to start sending body parts of the gals first. The police chief got a hold of Mr. Lewis to get him to open up the bank and to get the treasure. Mr. Lewis said it wasn't going to make no difference if he opened the bank. The vault was on a time block and couldn't be opened till Monday morning at 9 a.m. Now, this is a heck of a pickle, said the chief. We got to figure out something real quick like. Well, the chief reported back to the families that it was no-go at the bank and welcomed any suggestions. They was all a-stewing over what to do whilst the drama played out at the hideout. It's a little serious around here now. They knowed where the hideout was because one of the officers seed Ollie the mare rabbit hunting, and he seed when the panel truck pulled up into the old house Gene Henderson was using for gambling. That was pure luck. The last resort would be to storm the house because the kids might be hurt or killed. Jesse began to talking to the crooks. At first, they didn't pay him no mind. Jesse knowed about the time lock and told Rocco that was the reason why they couldn't get into it right now. Boy, did he go to a ranting and a raving. You know, Jesse said, if you go to a torturing us kids, it'll go very hard on you. There ain't nothing to do but to wait it out till Monday morning if you want that treasure or cash at the bank. What I'd do is be there at 9 a.m. and make sure nobody but the bank president was in the building and make sure the police didn't do nothing about it or put them on a wild goose chase. Shut up, kid, said Rocco. Well, then Jake spoke up and told Rocco he wanted a word with him and Irvin. You know, the kid's got a point. Let Irvin get a letter to the bank president or to the little red-headed gal's paw and set it up. Irvin, go in there and keep an eye on them kids, said Rocco. Now, Rocco and Jake said to Jake, we let Irvin lead the cops off on that wild goose chase, and we snatched the treasure and the cash from the bank and get away on the old smuggler's route down the river. We got Iron Boat hid out not far from here, and she is fast. Once we get to the Mississippi, we got it made all the way to the ocean and to the islands. We'll be set for life down there for sure. If things go bad, we can use the kids as hostages. Now that's the plan, Jake. Irvin is expendable. We don't need him, and we sure ain't going to give him a cut. Whilst the crooks was a-talking, Jesse told Emily Ann to be sure to mention about daylight saving time changing Sunday. That ought to give them a clue about the vault. Don't let on now, just word it so they get the hint. Well, Buster hired was a-grinning. They got it now, the folks needed to get it too. Emily Ann wrote the letter and told her pa not to tell anybody but Mr. Lewis about the plan and be sure he remembered Sunday that they have to cancel their trip because they would be late. Well, Irvin took the letter and throwed it through the window again like he done before. Well, Mr. Stevens said he was sure glad he ain't put a new glass in yet. They was wearing out that window glass. The police chief and county sheriff, state police colonel, FBI, and Mr. Lewis was all there with the families scratching their heads about the letter. We just got to figure out what Emily Ann is meaning in her letter. There's something there, but we just need to get our mind round about it. Well, everybody was plumb frizzlated over the whole situation and worried to death about them youngins. Dang it, about that time everybody was giving up, Walter rolled up on his and gray. How's it a-going, y'all, he said. Ms. McBrayer told him they was all tuckered out and stupefied over the whole dang situation. Walter said he knowed the boys and they'd figure their way out somehow. Reckon I'd better be getting on back home since I gotta get up early tomorrow morning with the time change and all. Well, that's it, Buster's Grandma Clara said as she overheard what Walter was a-saying. Come here, y'all. We got the answer to the message in the letter. All of them huddled up in the police station and was sure enough relieved Mr. Lewis confirmed that the bank vault would be an hour early due to a daylight saving time, and that's the whole key to it. Well, all the police folks said that would let them be inside the vault when the crooks come to rob the bank. Well, Mr. Lewis was to hunker down as soon as he got to the vault where it would open. The other officers would be hid out so they could round up the rest of the gang. Well, Buster had been working on getting his hands freed up and had them loosened up a bit, but needed some help. Well, Buster told Hired to scooch as close to him as he could and try to get his hands free. Hired, you know about rope, see what you can do. Well, Hired said, my fingers is just too big, maybe one of the gals can help. Well, Emily Ann said to let her try, and she began to working on them ropes. The other gals took the notion to help Jessie and Hired too. Well, Alma May, lean over here and get my hairpin out of my hair, says Rachel Elizabeth. It will help a lot, I'm a-thinking. Well, Alma May got the hairpin with her teeth and dropped it into Hired's hands. He passed it over to Emily Ann, and she went to work on Buster's ropes. It was a-working all right, but Buster hoped it'd be in time for him to get 'em free. Night come full on, and Irvin fed 'em all and give 'em some water. He took 'em one by one to the outhouse before settling in for the night. Rocco and Jake went out for a good spell and come back late. They told Irvin that the truck was gassed up and ready to go and be ready in the morning. The plan Rocco and Jake made was to just let Jake stay with the youngins whilst Irvin took Rocco to the bank. When Rocco went into the bank, Irvin was to take off like a scalded dog and lead the police on a wild goose chase. Rocco was going to take Mr. Lewis' car and a hostage if need be. Rocco said he would probably just lock Mr. Lewis in the vault when he left or just shoot him. Didn't make no never mind to him. Didn't make any never mind at all, 'cause whatever was easiest, he said. What a feller, boy. Well, Rocco and Irvin left on out round about 8 o'clock. The sniper reported to the police chief and FBI man in charge what all was going on at the hideout. There weren't no way them crooks was going to harm the young'uns or get away. The sheriff's water patrol done found the fast boat hid out along the river and made sure it wasn't going to run. It was down to it. Rocco walked into the bank and snatched up Mr. Lewis whilst Irvin lit on out in the panel truck. Well, Rocco told Mr. Lewis to open the vault at exactly 9 a.m. Well, Mr. Lewis looked at his pocket watch that come from his and Daddy and counted down the seconds. At exactly 9 a.m., he entered the combination and turned the wheel. Well, Rocco asked Mr. Lewis where his car was, and Mr. Lewis said it was out in the back in the alley. That's just fine, and was a-grinning as the door to the vault was a-opening. Rocco went to shoot Mr. Lewis when the door was about 2/3 open, but Big Jim shot first. He hit him in the shoulder with his .45 Colt that put him down. The police that was there rushed out and took Rocco into custody. Mr. Lewis was white as a sheet but unflappable. He looked to Big Jim and winked. The police surrounded Irvin, and he was took in and put in handcuffs without a fuss or a fight. Well, back at the hideout, the sniper had a bead on Jake and was prepared to shoot if necessary. It was not. Emily Ann had finally got his and ropes to where he could free his himself, and Buster busted loose from the ropes and leaped on Jake when he heard the noise out back. Now he is fit to be tied, I tell you, and Buster whooped that feller something terrible. Harmed him up and left him lay. Well, Buster untied Hired and Jessie and turned the gals. And all of a sudden Jake jumped up and lit out across the yard to the old river. It was a right nasty place this time of year, you know. Jake was a-floundering around in the water trying to get away when he fell in a hole by a big old cypress tree. He began to holler and help, and the sniper was the first to get close to him. But it was too late. The water was a-rolling with cottonmouth snakes a-mating, and they covered him up, hundreds of them, just a-biting him. He didn't live long, and he sunk underneath the water covered in snakes. The sniper told him that he would call somebody to come fetch him to the morgue later on. It had been a frightful day for the families, more so the gals than the boys. But them young'uns had backbone. Chapter 5. Mr. Stevens told Buster at the police station in front of his and Grandpa and Grandma that he sure enough was the man to look after his and little gal Emily Ann and would always be welcome at his and home. Fact is, he told all the parents, all these boys are the finest and most resourceful young men in the land. About that time, Ms. Stevens joined Mr. Stevens at his side, and both of them teared up a mite. Well, all the women folk gathered round Miss Stevens, and the men folk went to shaking the boys in each other's hands. Well, after everybody calmed down a mite, they all went home. Seemed everybody was just plumb tuckered out, excepting the boys. They all met up down there to their swimming hole with Walter. Walter said, "What y'all done went and got into now, and without me to save you, and went to belly laughing." Said he knowed it was a mite serious when he rode his and mare up to Buster's Grandma Clara and spoke to him. Sure glad everybody was all right, though. Well, Buster, Jesse, and Hired had to tell Walter everything that happened and about how it all got started. Well, Jesse and Buster had been a-talking with Hired about the money they found and what to do with it. They figured they would study on it first spell and wasn't going to leave Walter out. Never did none of that. Them boys always did everything, all for them even. Walter said he dearly did appreciate their sentiments and generosity, but just wanted to do what they thought best. And Jesse said we got to think on the future and left it at that. It wasn't but 2 days later that Mr. Stevens called and said they was going to take that there trip the next Friday, and he was going to take all 4 boys, including little Lou Ann and the gal Walter was a-sparking, to even out the foursome. Hadn't been for Walter riding up and telling about the daylight saving time, things could have turned out a whole lot different, he said. Well, Mr. Stevens had talked to all the boys, folks, and Lou Ann and Alma Mays as well. Fact is, after they all got back, all the families was to meet up at the Stevens place for supper and some fun. Well, all the young'uns got out of school early on Friday and met up at the Stevens place for the trip to Memphis. They was all excited because none of them ever been to Memphis before. Well, Mr. Stevens took them all over to the train station next to the police station for the train ride to Memphis. It was their first time on a train, too. There was snacks and soda water aplenty for them to eat and drink on this 4-hour trip over. When they got there, a hotel shuttle picked them up and brung them to the Hotel Peabody downtown. They was just in time to see the ducks a-walking in the lobby, and the gals was squealing how cute they was. Well, after settling in, Mr. Stevens told all of them that he had a business meeting but would see them later on for supper here in the hotel. Well, all the young'uns met up for supper a bit early in the lobby and was a-wandering through all the different shops and stuff up there. "This whole place is a wonderment," said Buster. The gals had a high old time just a-windy shopping. About that time, Mr. and Miss Stevens showed up and told them, "Let's eat." He led them to this huge dining room with such a spread you ever did see. Well, Buster was some goggle-eyed, I tell you. None of them ever seen such a fancy place as this. Well, Buster held his in peace till blessing was said, and Mr. Stevens said to help theirselves. Now, none of them knowed exactly what to do, so Mr. Stevens led the way and explained they could eat as much of anything there was. There was plates stacked up, and when you was done with one, a waiter would pick it up and tote it off, and you got to clean up by the food. You didn't use the same plate. They didn't know about all that. Well, Mr. and Miss Stevens was just a-smiling at the young'uns with their first experience with society. Well, Buster was especially a-wondering watching that boy eat. "I'd hate to feed that boy," said Miss Stevens. "I imagine Clara has her hands full with him to feed morning, noon, and night." At that, both of them laughed heartily. Well, after supper, Mr. Stevens took them to a concert with a lady named Patsy Cline. It was really fun listening to the country music they heard on the radio, and she had Loretta Lynn singing with her too. Well, the next day after breakfast, they headed on out to the Memphis Zoo, and Howard had his camera, and Buster had his and Grandma's Kodak brownie too. He still has it to this day. Well, Buster made Howard take his and pictures too, 'cause he tweren't no good at it like Howard was, he said. Well, Buster only liked to look at pictures, not take 'em or be in 'em. Thought his and ears were too big, he said. Well, let's see. They went to the Memphis Zoo. Had all manner of things to see there. And after the zoo, they headed on over to the Pink Palace. Howard was a-snapping pictures like they was going out of style. The boy dearly loved taking pictures. Here's some facts and information about the Pink Palace, past and present. But I can't give them to you, folks. We're going to stop right here. Let me explainify this to these folks. Now, if y'all remember me telling you that Buster and the Boys at yahoo.com is an email, and that all the original stories has pictures and facts and all kind of things like that, and if you want them, all you have to do is write to Buster and the Boys at yahoo.com, and old Buster, that's me, will make sure you get all the original stories with the pictures and recordings of all the stories. Now, it'll come by something called Transfer Big Files. So you download it to your computer and you'll have them all. And this original story, I think the one I'm reading to you is about 33 pages. But the original one's 81 pages. Got all the pictures in it. So, all right, continuing on where the boys and the girls and the Stevenses went. They left the Memphis Zoo and went to the Pink Palace Museum and Planetarium. Well, after all the sightseeing, the real treat was Graceland. Of course, now that's Buster's favorite. He really liked Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. All the boys and gals were just itching to get there. Well, Mr. Stevens had arranged for a private tour for the young'uns, and they figured that was a surprise he told them about. Elvis's cousin was there to show them around and answer any questions they had. This here is some more picture taking of Howard's and some more information for the folks, but only if you write Buster and you can see them. Graceland. Well, all the boys and gals was plumb tickled to death with the tour of Graceland. It was the highlight of their trip. Mr. Stevens gathered them all up and asked them if they was ready to eat, seeing how it was going on supper time. "Let's get a move on," he said, and they all got on the bus thinking they was going back to the Hotel Peabody. Boy, was they in for a surprise. The bus dropped them off down on the Mississippi River bank, where there was an old paddle-wheeler steamboat awaiting there. Well, Emily Ann asked her pa what this was all about. "This is your birthday surprise along with the pony," said Mr. Stevens. "The boat is a midnight evening supper cruise with a live band. I know how much you like listening to music, so I hope you enjoy yourself with your friends." The boat was just spectacular. Mr. Stevens let the young'uns sit topside for supper, whilst Mr. and Mrs. Stevens sit in the main salon, as they called it. Supper was fit for a king, and the boys with their gals was sure enough enjoying the night air and moon whilst a cruising down that old Mississippi. Well, Howard was still a-taking his and pictures of everybody and everything, including the boat. The Memphis Queen, too. Mr. Stevens had chartered the boat for them that evening, and when supper was over, he called to the young'uns to come on down to the salon. "Now for the rest of your surprise," he said to Emily Ann. "You have had such a harrowing experience. Me and your mama wanted to do something special for you. So, for your entertainment, tonight is a couple of friends of mine to help on out." Well, the band struck up with the song Emily Ann knowed from heart, "Teddy Bear," outstepped Elvis. I get tongue-tied because I really like him. Well, the gal just went plumb crazy, a-hollering and a-swooning. Elvis come down off of the stage and kneeled down and right in front of Emily Ann and sung to her and then kissed her on the cheek. She liked to have died right there. Well, Elvis sang Treat Me Nice, then come sit down next to Emily Ann and just visited with everybody. He said to the rest of the boys and gals, well, they liked an autograph on a record he brung with them. Well, one of his sidekicks brung out a box set of his hits for each of the boys and gals and a signed picture for them too. Elvis got up and said he had a couple of more songs in him and asked each one of the young'uns to pick one of their favorites of his. Now, Rachel Elizabeth wanted Jailhouse Rock. Alma May wanted Big Hunk of Love. Little Lou Ann asked for Don't Be Cruel. Walter hollered for Hound Dog, which that figures. Howard said Hard-Headed Woman. And Jesse allowed for I Got Stung. Where'd that come from? And Buster asked it real polite like for How Great Thou Art. Well, Elvis come over to Buster and told him he was a man after his own heart. He said he ain't never sung that song to nobody except in there in Graceland, and was thinking about doing some recording of gospel music with that on the record. He winked at Buster and told him come on by anytime. Well, after Elvis sang his songs, he told him all about Mr. Stevens being a friend of his and his mama. Then he began to leave on out, but stopped and turned around and said one of his friends was over to the house, and he started to come over to the boat and asked if he could come along. You don't mind saying hello to him, do you? Heck, fire no, said all of them. Tell him to come on out. About then, the curtain opened up, and there was Jerry Lee Lewis a-banging on his piano a-singing Great Balls of Fire. Well, after the song, Jerry Lee come over and greeted everybody and left them with a signed picture and some records of his. Jerry Lee said he had to go. Elvis has left the building. Well, that was one humdinger of an evening, exclaimed Buster. Jesse said that was an understatement. Walter allowed he was sure grateful to be included in the trip, and Howard said unforgettable. Well, Emily Ann run up to her papa and mama and hugged them with all her might. She told them it was the best birthday anyone could ever wish for her. Mr. and Miss Stevens told her they loved her and just wanted her to be happy. The boys and gals gathered around and expressed their thanks and gratitude for the wonderful and memorable trip of their lives. Well, we're at the dock. Let's hit the hay for the train ride home tomorrow morning, said Mr. Stevens. They all said good night at the hotel and went to their rooms. As expected, the gals and the boys all palavered up into the night about all the goings-on and the fun they had. Finally, all of them went to sleep, all tuckered out but happy, thrilled and full. Well, after the boys and gals got back home, they told their folks all about the great trip they was on. But it was back to chores and sure enough hard work of making a living, for everybody had to do their part. Well, 2 weeks later, Mr. Stevens called all the boys' folks and the gals too and asked them all to supper and said he would have them picked up at their own houses. Well, everybody loaded up into a bus he sent and went. All the families was together. Mr. Stevens told them they was going to take a little trip to Little Rock for supper. That's why he asked them to be ready early. The bus got them to the state capitol, and Mr. Stevens led them all into the rotunda. When everybody was seated, all manner of reporters and politicians come out and stood a-waiting with cameras and notepads. About that time, Governor Faubus walked out and stood at a dais, or pulpit if you ask the boys, and called each of the 4 boys' names to come up there with him at the front. Now, the boys' jaws dropped nearly to the floor, but they walked up to the governor. The governor shook each one of the boys' hand, and they come up, and his assistant had 2 boys stand beside him on each side. The governor then began to give a speech recounting their kidnapping and what they done to save the gals. Well, first off, the governor presented each of the boys the state's highest award for heroism. Then the FBI man gave him an award from the agency. And after that, the England police chief and mayor gave him the keys to the city. Well, pictures was took with them and the governor and the politicians from their city and county. The newspaper people went to asking all manner of questions and taking more pictures. Then Mr. Stevens and Emily Ann and Rachel Elizabeth come up and Mr. Stevens give a talk. More pictures was took and questions asked. What a shindig this turned out to be, said Walter. Might say, said Howard. Well, Buster whispered to Jesse, when they going to eat? Well, after all the hullabaloo, Governor Faubus took them all off to the side and said they was going to meet him at the governor's mansion for supper. The bus took everybody there, and everybody else but the families was there with Governor Faubus and his wife Alta. Sorry about that. Nobody was there but Buster and the boys and their families, with the governor and his wife. The governor said that there had been enough of taking pictures and talking and carrying on, but he was sure glad to meet the boys. He told them that Mr. Stevens had gone to school with his boy, Farrell, at the University of Arkansas, and he knowed Mr. Stevens' great-uncle Charles Hillman Bruff. Told him Hillman, as he called him, was the 25th governor of the state of Arkansas and a fine man. The governor and his wife said they dearly loved Buster's stuffed strawberries and wanted a recipe for him to serve VIPs at state dinners. Delicious, he said, and popped another one in his mouth. Gonna be a winner at the state fair, said the governor. See, Mr. Stevens done brung some from home for him. Epilogue. Well, after returning home, things began to settle down some. Friends, schoolmates, teachers, and folks that recognized him from all the pictures in the Arkansas Gazette and Arkansas Democrat still stopped to talk to him, ask questions, want an autograph, and want their picture took with them every once in a while. To tell you the truth, it was a wearing a mite thin and worrisome. On Sunday the next month, all the boys' pa set them down for a little man-to-man talk. First off, Mr. McBrayer, most older folks called him Mac, asked if and they knowed exactly who Mr. Stevens was. Well, said Jesse, he's a right fine feller and respected as far as I can tell. All that is true enough. But he is a real power player in politics. He is one of the richest men in the country from oil and gas holdings. Mr. McBrayer said he has a packaging business, said Buster. Rightfully so. And he packages everything from pickles to chewing gum and everything in betwixt. But that's just a hobby for him. Buster's grandpa Gus spoke up and told Buster that his stuffed strawberries was going to go international. Not only because they're good, but because Mr. Stevens loves his only child and thinks he wants to do something special to repay you for saving her and making her happy. Now he has enough sense to know that y'all two young'uns ain't near ready for courting and such, but he sure enough thinks a lot of you. Now this here talk concerns not only you, but Jesse as well. You boys need to watch your step in this courting business. We don't want no feelings hurt here, so just be honest and do right. Why, sure, Grandpa, said Buster. Mr. McBrayer looked at Jesse and asked him if he got the drift about Rachel Elizabeth, Mr. Stevens' niece. Yes, I do, said Jesse. Well, this here talk ain't about being a fear to Mr. Stevens or his money or his political power. It's all about our families. Then Mr. Ollinger and Mr. Holmes told Howard and Walter the same thing since they was all associated with each other. Y'all all got a bright future ahead of you, and y'all got brothers and sisters too, said Mr. McBrayer. You have to be mindful of these. Plus Elvis Presley sent a note, Buster, said Grandpa Gus. He give you and the rest of the boys and the gals some tickets for his concert when he comes to Little Rock next month. Told me to tell you to bring him some of them stuffed strawberries, too. A bunch of them. Well, when the boys got off to theirselves, Buster said didn't know what that was all about, whilst scratching his and hay. Well, Buster, Walter, and Howard all looked at Jesse when he said, it means no matter what them gals want to do, don't get too serious and be a gentleman. Well, Howard piped up and said, let's go fishing.